Yeah, we don't have to be that formal, I guess. I hope that's okay with you.
I hope that's fine. Yeah, that's good.
Sam Rocha, it's a pleasure. Welcome you tonight here. Interdisciplinary religion group, fairly new idea. The idea is that we have graduate students who work on religious issues or encounter religion in their work in a vast number of fields. We don't really have a religious studies department for to do graduate work here on this university, so there's a little bit of a lacuna, a little bit of a lack of a space for graduate students to come together, discuss their work, discuss methodology, and discuss issues they come across. So you get a special introduction from Brett.
Do we want, as our second time, to introduce all of ourselves?
I think we should go around and everyone can say who she or he is and what she or he is working on. So that gives you a little bit of an introduction, and then we have Brett introducing you.
Sure.
And again, welcome in Madison. And well,
I'll start with personal. So I'm Brett Bertucci. I might have emailed you, and thanks for coming. I'm a doc student in ed school and do mostly history of education and look at United States religion clause jurisprudence and the schools. So that's kind of my project. Yeah, thanks for coming.
I'm Sarah Reed. I'm a PhD candidate in German, and I work on German American studies, and my dissertation's on Mormonism in German 19th century literature, so that's kind of my religious angle there. So, and there was a lot of it. I can tell you all about it sometimes. So.
Yeah, Ulrich Rosenhagen, director of the new Center for Religion and Global Citizenry, who started this new interdisciplinary religion group, and my dissertation work is long gone. But I occasionally write on interreligious issues. That's a new field, of course. And I also work on Rudolf Otto, the German theologian, and there's a lot to discover, which is a lot of fun. So, yeah.
I'm Emily Tran. I'm a first-year student in history and EPS. I don't study religion at all. I'm just here because the topic is of personal interest. And my research focuses on school desegregation in Boston and social memory.
Killian Harrer, third-year grad student in the history department, and I work on pilgrims and especially pilgrimages across state borders in the revolutionary Napoleonic era.
Dan Hummel, I'm a postdoc at the Institute for Research in the Humanities, which is just across the hallway. I'm just finishing a book on the modern Christian Zionist movement and American evangelical Christian relations with the State of Israel.
Anthony Cerulli. I'm a historian of religions, teaching in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here on campus. And my work looks at the confluence of the history of religions, education, and medicine in India, in classical literature and in the contemporary period, and the use of that literature.
I'm Andrew Amstutz. I'm a postdoc here at the Center for the Humanities upstairs, and I'm affiliated with the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and my work looks at the history of science in Islam and modern South Asia, also a bit on the history of medicine and how that intersects with Islam in modern India and Pakistan.
So you want me to say some nice words about you first? So this is a good friend and mentor, Sam Rocha. He's an assistant professor of philosophy and education at the University of British Columbia. And I would say that might be a misnomer that you do so much more than just, I think, philosophy and education. So certainly trained as a phenomenologist. Now you're going to correct me if I'm wrong. But Sam has a lot of, I would say, interdisciplinary work with Christian theology and philosophy of education, and is also an enormously accomplished recording artist. The only scholar I know who will put out an album as a companion to his books. So your first was a musical accompaniment or meditation on Augustine's Confessions, and the second, just a folk album. But he's here by the gracious generosity of WCER, the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research, has a program for visiting scholars. So Sam's here to give a couple lectures, and through the program, a grad student can nominate a faculty member from another institution to come and enlighten the dialogue in the ed school. So I was glad to have Sam's application approved, and I was really excited for him to talk to this group because, well, we need more faculty with interests like Sam on campus, and that's not the case at the moment, but we have this opportunity. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks for that. And thank you for this and for all the introductions. My plan that I'd kind of talked with Brett about was to maybe just really just introduce myself a bit, and then maybe use the title Theology, Politics, and University as a bit of a kind of prompt on which we could perhaps maybe pose questions, comments, disputes, what have you. And I don't usually like to do the whole I'd like this to be more of a dialogue than a talk, because it never is that. But and I'm not so sure that's always the point. But the idea here is to really be able to respond maybe to certain questions that might emerge from here. I guess by way of getting into that, my training is in phenomenology early on, and then later on in philosophy of education, which is its own kind of can of worms as a field, or if it is a field, or all that stuff. But I was born into and raised in a lay missionary Catholic family, so I grew up in kind of full-time ministry, right, my whole life, and I was educated both in that period and then in undergrad and stuff within the Catholic intellectual tradition, pretty just straightforwardly. And I did my PhD at Ohio State University, so obviously not a Catholic school. And in some ways, it was a pretty edgy move, I thought, at the time. In fact, my first reaction to going to Ohio State was just I can't go to school like that. It was kind of and it wasn't really like an axiomatic it's evil or anything. It was just sort of almost like an ontological. I don't go to places like that. It was just sort of this almost sense of not being able to go to a place like that. And so my experience at Ohio State was one in which, and I think this is an experience that's happened in many cases, and I think you spoke to it when you talked about not having a religious studies department here, where I found my way. I found a way to, I guess, a way to be religious in a way that I hadn't been religious before, because in the past it was within and against whatever a tradition, whereas at Ohio State it was very much kind of it was very much an experience, at least anecdotally for me, that was tense, and some of my mentors would catch on. They're I kind of feel like what you're saying here is super Catholic, and I was oh yeah, it probably is, and I was lucky to actually have one of my supervisors is a Mormon, and he had we had similar and also very different discussions, depending on what angle we were going into things at. Coming out of my doctoral program, though, I really came to realize that my own work as a philosopher, and in particular in philosophy of education, and in particular when we think about just the very idea of what is education, it's kind of on a collision course with a very series of very ancient religious ideas about the formation of the person, the immortality of the soul. I mean, all that stuff is right at the surface if one wants to look at it that way. And I found myself more and more basically saying, it's not that I want to look at it that way, but I can't see it any other way, right? And so I think my work fairly early after my PhD took a decidedly overtly religious turn. My first little book that came out, I tried to talk about this idea of pastoral philosophy, and I tried to be very kind of dodgy about what pastoral meant there. Not that it was particularly I wasn't doing a good job of hiding anything there. But it was a text that kind of dipped into but never went all the way directly towards. And then as my work developed more and more, though, I think in the field I was more and more encouraged and felt more and more kind of, in some sense, called, I guess, to engage overtly with these questions. And I also began to realize that things like political theology and particular discussions in kind of contemporary theological circles, and that there was really no reason that there was something a bit provincial about my kind of hesitations, if I could back them up with good reasons, and literature and conversations and what have you. And so, by the time I entered my position at UBC, I felt very comfortable, and I feel very comfortable, I think, now, being both a confessional Catholic in my own personal life, and realizing that carries with it a certain set of there's an exchange rate between that identity and the work I do as a scholar, in particular in a secular institution like the University of British Columbia. And all that to say that today, I was telling this to Brett in the car, I have so I do work with a mandatum, which is an ecclesiastical, basically it's permission from my Archbishop on behalf of the Church to teach in theological institutions within the Roman Catholic Church. It doesn't apply here, actually, so it's like a jurisdictional kind of theological credential. But that has opened up even my own tradition as a place where I can kind of go back. And I've realized that actually some of the religious inflections that I felt were missing in these so-called secular spaces are actually perhaps even more missing in overtly Catholic spaces like Catholic schools or places like that. And so I think I'm a little bit less. I'm realizing that voice has its own place even within its own environment. And speaking of interreligious ideas, I don't know why exactly, but I've been able to bring together a really interesting group of students working both on very kind of sociological questions, in particular related to the Middle East and Islam. The Middle East and Islam, and in particular, in other cases, Iran and its kind of very unique relationship to Islam in that context. A scholar working on the Gita and its ideas on education, and a group of students doing work within Judaism. I joke around that the Christians are sort of doing the work too, but they're just a little bit. You can kind of slip into the cracks, I guess, of the regular literature a bit more, depending on what one's doing. So they don't talk about their work in those terms. But over the last 4 years at UBC, there's been something of a community of people who mainly don't gather, though, around the religious bell that doesn't call us together. For the most part, what we've been doing is just trying to read really difficult books that we probably couldn't read by ourselves. So in the last year and a half, we've read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, from one cover to the other, Spinoza's Ethics, and then we've read Heidegger's Being in Time. We're going to finish in about 2.5 weeks. So we have Division 1 the fall, Division 2 this time. And we're going to pick up the Confessions over the summer. And it's probably not entirely clear how that's exactly a religious conversation. And in some sense, it's not. But in another sense, there's something about the book and the coming together and the dialogue that I would class as having a kind of a religious identity of sorts. So that's the work I'm doing, and that's kind of how it kind of intersects with my own life and with kind of coming up through here. I'm fairly aware, especially from the very niche parochial Catholic circles I run in, of the anxieties around theology, religion, secularism, politics, the university. I think I have a fairly decent grasp of what that's about and what that looks like, and I think I have some views that aren't necessarily identical to some of those things. But to be honest, I don't have probably as strong of a grasp over what would motivate a less sectarian set of questions around religion and what have you. I have talked about this in other cases, but it may be the case that there are some differences, or perhaps there are some resonances. And so I was just hoping that we could maybe think for a little bit together about what some of these questions are, or what some of these challenges are. And I'm really impressed by the introductions and what everyone's doing. So this doesn't necessarily need to be some kind of like an anecdotal therapeutic conversation. I think we can talk about this at a fairly difficult, hopefully, level. And so if there's clear counterfactual cases that someone isn't thinking about, I hope we can be agonistic here about this and not let it kind of turn into too much of a basic question. I have one point in case no one else has a point to start with, but I wanted to see if maybe I could turn the floor back over to see if anybody has any particular interest that's burning at them in terms of what brings you here, or if you're just interested more generally in the topic.
I want to ask, you mentioned the moment in your first couple of years at OSU where a professor would identify your ideas as Catholic, and you were nervous.
Yeah.
Could you talk about what you were nervous about, if you could identify it, and whether those anxieties were founded in reality, and if so, or if not, how did you figure that out?
I mean, sure, I guess early on what I was really worried about was that I didn't quite understand what this institution called the university was, right? So my exposure, I'm a first generation college student that didn't really grow up in a like super academic kind of family. So and as we all know, like the difference between an undergraduate university experience and a doctoral, like it was very new to. So I actually attribute a lot of my insecurities less to the question of religion and more to the question of like what precisely is this university thing, and how do I act, and how do I talk, and how do I behave, and the only analogical logic I had to make those behavioral, in some sense, determinations, though, came from my experience growing up in the church. And I couldn't but help, even without the very sophisticated historical understanding of the university as already, ensconced in a particular religious patrimony and all that. But just at a more like basic level, it was very easy for me to relate, for instance, the hierarchical set of relations between a supervisor and a student, or the way in which the church the university was arranged, in a way. It made total institutional sense to me bureaucratically at every level. After all, Roman Catholics, so like highly bureaucratized, hierarchical, church structures. So I was translating the institution, to use the overused expression, kind of always already, right? Like that was the way I was finding my way through the institution. When people said they saw Catholicism in my work, I think it made me a little bit insecure about like maybe this is a bad analogy, right? Like maybe this isn't the right, maybe this is not the playbook to be using. Maybe there's another one. Maybe it's naive of me because I made a lot of really stupid mistakes because of my lack of kind of academic pedigree, I guess you could say. I hadn't mastered Chicago when I showed up to. I remember my advisor would be like, "Why are you putting quotation marks around your block quotes?" And I was like, "Because I didn't read Turabian very closely, obviously." But I mean, there were a lot of conventions that are kind of just stupid that I was doing early on. So my worry was that maybe that note that was being made was kind of like, you're importing something that's not here. What was exciting was to survey bookshelves by my mentors and see Alistair MacIntyre and Charles Taylor and Jean-Luc Marignon and like names that I knew within a kind of Catholic philosophical milieu, contemporary names, and then to look back again and see, well, usually there's that gaping medieval hole in everyone's shelf, but to see that they had a few maybe things, or maybe, City of God was in there or something, and to start to kind of, be able to understand that, like, this is my kind of intellectual swimming pool, I guess. So, I don't know if it was, I think it was true in a basic sense, but my concern with its truth was more about how it interrupted the way I was kind of making my way through this world of the university. Now, to carry that forward, though, into what I think you're asking, is that, yeah, my claim today is that, on the one hand, it makes, I think, an enormous amount of sense to not just work through analogy between the university as an institution and the ecclesial institutions that are in some sense historically intermeshed with it, but even it makes sense, I think, to try to understand the university itself on, I would say, overtly theological terms. And I'll give an example. I've done a little bit of work on thinking about like the political progression of modernity across the kind of early anti-monarchy response we see in like early liberalism. And so, and by the way, like to me, this is really nothing other than like a particular reading of Carl Schmitt's book on political theology. So that's the book that starts off with the claim that that political theology really begins with the question of the sovereign and who decides the exception, right? And that this is essentially always has been a theological question. And so my claim is, if we take that point, who decides the exception, who is the sovereign, then the the dispute of sovereignty at the beginning of modernity, we might say, is on a monotheistic account of sovereignty that's very, hopefully, obvious and clear within a feudal monarchical view of authority on the one hand, and on the other hand, this other view of liberalism that I think approximates, especially as it develops a bit more, approximates something like a more like deistic understanding of authority. So it's not the absence of God completely. It's not atheistic, but it does sort of not have quite an accessible bridge between the sovereignty of God and the need for the people in a community to kind of make their own decisions and decide. And so then liberalism kind of seems to chasten monarchy in that way. And I think that's one maybe complicated way to read, for instance, even the difference between I mean, there's varieties of this. So, like, if we look at like Hobbes's account of social contractarian philosophy at some level, he seems deeply aware of this, and this is why he's in some sense attached to the monarch, but for kind of different reasons, not for the kind of benevolent theological reasons. Whereas with Locke, obviously, he's willing to kind of part ways with this, more easily. But if we don't have to overcomplicate that, what's interesting is that immediately after this kind of dawn of political theology and this particular conflict between the account of sovereignty of monarchs and this monotheist account, and then this deistic account of the liberals, the first critiques of modernity that are kind of mutually inclusive critiques, right? They're against monarchs and the old kind of feudal society and against liberalism, and this I think emerges with like Rousseau in the 18th century and develops into something that I think becomes a different account of sovereignty that we can theologically understand, something closer to like pantheism, like vox populi, the voice of God is the voice of the people, and the kind of like this kind of instead of this unbridged idea of the deistic, but this kind of like total solipsistic, replacement of God with the people, and so the general will, I think, would be one particular political account of that. All that to say, as these changes in like modern periods are happening in early modernity, we can account for these in all kinds of ways. For political theory, we can talk about the ways in which some of these things can be tracked through like the pure philosophical disputations between rationalism and empiricism, and then the Kantian experiment. I mean, we can do all kinds of things like mess with that. But my view is that, at least in addition to those accounts, theology gives us a particular way of understanding authority through those periods that maps on, I think, quite nicely to making sense of, for instance, the evolving university that's evolving at that time as well, and reach its peak in kind of the Prussian, research model of the university, which is very different than the more kind of pastoral institution we see in the Middle Ages, or the more classical institutions we see in the Alexandrian periods, or stuff like that. And so, it's a super long-winded way to say that, like, what I realized was that I was kind of playing pool with my left hand because I wasn't sure if I was allowed to play with my right. And I came to a point where I was like, holy smokes, I've read from like Gilgamesh, Homer, Hesiod, to Pope John Paul II, and now I'm just reading moderns as if I'm pretending not to know all that stuff, and because I thought there was some like weird sort of institutional expectations that I show that I can be a proper, because I do respect tradition, enormous amount, too much probably, and so I was like, this is a secular institution, I'm going to read. How about William James? That seems like a good secular person, you know, like he still loved religion, but like it was fun for me to do that, and so I realized that was sort of immature early on, and to that extent not true, and to that extent, on the one hand, theology I think provides a powerful, already present account of the university, of politics, of society, of all these things, even of the idea of when people talk about secularism. I mean, I'm always now the one to remind them that it's a religious term. It's secula, secularum. I mean, it's the idea of this age and then the age to come. And so that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, I think that I think there's this problem of like everything becoming everything, right? And so one of the ways in which I've learned at UBC that these accounts of the sovereign universities, there's an entire way in which you can look at instructional design and like map it according to like liturgical changes. Like whenever liturgy is like facing the people, it's very constructivist, co-creation of knowledge, facing God, but together with everyone facing God in an Eastern direction. You know, I found lots of kind of fun ways to kind of use these guides for mapping things. But the great thing that I've been exposed to at UBC has been not the commonalities that one can find across, for instance, Abrahamic traditions and the ways they give these accounts, but in particular the ways in which these accounts don't work. And so like the really cool thing for me has been, for instance, at PS in Chicago a few weeks ago, I was responding to a paper that was trying to give an account of Bildung, this kind of classic German word for education, through a reading of the book of Genesis and the idea of the build or the image of God in chapter 1, verse 26, over and against the commentaries of Rocha in particular. And so here, like, my go-to, if I want to give an account of Genesis, is Augustine, book 13, right? Like, this is the Confessions, his account of his reading of Genesis. That's my natural move as a Catholic. Yet when I went there, because I needed to, just to kind of find my way, I realized that the text in Genesis was using plural pronouns for ostensibly the act of a God who is supposed to be radically one. I mean, that's the whole idea. But Augustine solves that problem like that with the Trinity, because of course, right? And as a Christian, that made so much sense to me. But thinking like a Jew, I couldn't believe Augustine, because that move can't be accounted for in Hebrew thought or Judaic thought. And so I had to find myself back to the 11th century and go to Rocha, or forward, I guess, from Augustine, and realize that Rocha has his own accounting of it, which was that God was actually conferring with the angels because man was made in the image of the angels, and he didn't want the angels to feel jealous of his new creations. And also, in the second commentary, to teach the faithful that one shouldn't ever act alone, that even God consulted and had counsel. And so there's this beautiful, in my opinion, pedagogical thing that happens in the very like ontogenetic account of the creation of the world on a purely Judaic reading that I would have never been able to understand really, or think about, or an encounter with the text I wouldn't have been able to have just as like a Roman Catholic reading Augustine and going back to the patristics as one does. So on the one hand, I think the overtly Christian Catholic tradition has given me an ability to engage with the questions I was very insecure about early on in a very powerful way. But there is a sense in which that can actually become overdetermined, I think. And so now I've found that interreligious, ecumenical, whatever words you want to put around that, but like being forced to go into a religious dialect that might share some basic ideas but doesn't share them all has really helped me deepen my sense of kind of where the cracks are. And in that sense, I think this is very different than your kind of therapeutic anecdotal account of one's own spiritual journey, so on and so forth. I think it forces one to really be a scholar, and I think that's the point, right? I mean, and whenever I look into, for instance, in my teaching, this is one more example. There was a time where I wanted to teach, but I didn't know why I taught the way I taught, and then I realized that this is very Catholic, that I was a very Catholic teacher, and then for a while I was like, oh, I need to hide that, and then I realized, but that's kind of what makes me whatever this good teacher idea is. So then I became very like, okay, so I'll do disputatio and questio and lexio, and I'll talk about the medieval traditions and da-da-da, which was very beautiful. It historicized things, the examination as an examen, and like, all these kind of pedagogical principles that are built in. But then I realized that, like, wait a minute, there's no actual like Christian monopoly over these, and a lot of these came out of overtly interreligious discourses, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula and elsewhere, like the disputatio in particular. Was a way for Muslims, Christians, and Jews to talk to each other and argue in some sense. And so then I started rolling back on that a bit and kind of seeing how like the influence of Aristotle comes in this way and Neoplatonism that way. And so it's made me, in my view, a better scholar of my own pedagogy as a result. But the first step was letting go of the shame, I guess, of being a medieval teacher. So now on like my teaching accounts, I describe my approach to teaching as basically taking a medieval approach, right? And my colleagues all laugh and it's very funny. But then I explain to them like, well, here are the principles, here are the traditions, here are the reasons, here's some evidence of these things put into practice, and here are the course evaluations with high numbers, and it's created a space, but in some sense it's just taking the space that was already there. But I hope I never stopped there. So like my student working with the Gita, I'm kind of terrified of what's going to happen there, because even within the Abrahamic circle, I can kind of dance along there, but when we jump out of there, I always kind of feel like, oh man, I've lost all over again, and kind of what is that going to be like? But I'm excited about it. I'm a little scared, but yeah. So it's a really long.
Yeah, you answered a lot of questions.
Yeah,
maybe some I didn't even have. It was
yeah, I know. Yeah.
On think about this for teaching. Do you think, and I've never attended or taught at a religious school, but do you think being at UBC allows you to sort of do things that in a non-confessional, non-sectarian setting, sort of read, sort of compare Jewish theologians with Augustine, with a Muslim theologian or something, in a more, do you have more freedom, or do you feel like you have more freedom to do that type of pedagogy there than you would at a Catholic school or something like that?
I mean, the classic response is sort of course, the kind of cliche of like, well, it depends what Catholic school, and it depends what secular school, and what have you. And I think that's true. But no, I think in principle, yeah. I mean, my view of the sort of ideal Catholic institution, and I don't think I'm here like marking off anything original. I think when I read Newman's the idea of a university, 1853, I read his vision of a university as kind of radically dispersed, radically cosmopolitan, not particularly Catholic. He's very clear about that, actually, in fact. And I think the U.S. has a Newman Association that seems to have read a different book other than the idea. I don't know what they have in mind, but it's clearly not what Newman wrote in The Idea of a University, because they rate colleges on their like Catholicity, and it usually has, in my mind, it has an inverse effect to what I read, how I read Newman at least. So. Yeah, that's my view, and of course that view though would ideally express itself in Catholic institutions too, and in religious institutions more broadly. The one thing though that can sometimes be a little bit of can kind of trip things up sometimes is there is the question I get at UBC of like, I get the like religious thing. Why don't we just call it spirituality though, and let's be a little bit more. Let's be a little bit more generic in our language, and let's not be so exclusive, so we can be more accessible and more inclusive to others. And that's a view that is popular, I think, but it's a view I very vehemently don't share. And the reason for it is that I think it's actually important as a confessional Catholic in a secular institution to kind of be very clear that I approach things ultimately from a particular worldview, which is not to say that worldview is, all things considered, the worldview that everyone should have or that we should reach a consensus around, but that I kind of don't pretend to come from nowhere. I mean, this critique has been made in a lot of the social sciences of like there is no such thing as a neutral, researcher and what have you. And I guess I kind of believe that in terms of how I work in a non-religious or a pluralistic, space. What worries me about, and I can see someday going and working for Catholic institutions. So but I think what would be important is that my approach would change. So one would expect by a certain default that I would, well, not in all Catholic institutions, I guess, but one would expect that if I'm teaching in a particular way, that it would be sort of plainly obvious that I'm working from a Catholic worldview. The question there then is that what else is there? Like it can't just be Catholic worldview. Like for instance, I'm much more of an Augustinian than I am a Thomist, and this is a thing I would never want to totalize the kind of Catholicity inside of an institution that's doing that. Whereas in a secular institution, not for the sake of totalizing, but just of being honest, I guess I always want to kind of give people a sense of what my direction is into things,
Yeah.
But to your general question, I feel extremely free, in an ironic way, to do the work I do in a place like UBC. It's almost permissive to the point of making me feel a bit nervous because, for instance, there is no magisterial authority in a secular institution unless we want to do the earlier move of turning my president into the Pope and reordering and renaming the institution according to this kind of ecclesial set of languages. But properly speaking, there's a permissiveness there that is sometimes, I think, starts to eat its own tail. So in my community, in my department, we want to talk about what are we into, what are we doing, and recently the words social justice have been very popular in schools of education, and I think there's good reason for that. But whenever that conversation comes up, just to get a really concrete example, well, I can't help but mention, that term was actually coined in Italian in the 1940s in a journal called Civita Cattolica, which was under the auspices of the Vatican, of Catholics trying to make sense of how they could enter into modernity after trying not to for so long, and before I know it, it's 19th century church history as a way to engage with a term that really no one cares about to that at that level, and so then the question is is Sam trying to baptize the department and but you chose the words and not us and stuff, but I think my colleagues, to their credit, there's a wit involved. The other day we were having a meeting where we were talking about how to convert a position from one thing to another, and the other philosopher, Claudia Rutenberg, says, "Well, Sam has other ideas probably about conversion, but and everyone got a good laugh out of that and stuff." And so I think it lightens the mood in unique ways, and because it's a secular institution. So yeah, in general, I think that's true. Yeah, I know there's a lot of horror stories as well, and there are exclusions, and there are those things too. So I don't want to be cavalier about that. I mean, I'm my ancestry is Mexican, and I'm very aware of the Porfiriato of 1910 and the priests shot in the streets, and so I'm not at all cavalier about the teeth of a secular idea in relationship to religion as well, but it's not my experience, right? In beautiful British Columbia.
I have a question about your understanding of theology, I think. It's in your first response, you used it a few different ways, I think, and I found it really interesting in your anecdote from a conference you were responding to the study of Genesis, right? And then you went to Augustine, and you found that philological engagement with that text just brought you to a new understanding of something that you felt really comfortable with. It led you to another perspective, the Jewish perspective on this text. And you said something like, that's when you really become a scholar, when you're able to step outside of your sort of wheelhouse, or bailiwick or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that is still theological, an exercise in theology, or if it's something else.
Yeah.
Because if I tie that to your sort of your perception in grad school of, or I don't know if it's a perception or if somebody actually said you're a little bit too Catholic, right?
It wasn't too. No TOO, just very Catholic.
Your Catholicness is showing.
Yeah.
So that can mean different things in the context of whether it was a paper you submitted for a course on the history of religion, or if it were a theology course, or if it were philosophy of education. It could mean different things. So I'm just curious if you could just sort of riff on a little bit of that.
Yeah, I mean,
because I think if I could just add this which is trying to understand also your sense of the role of religious studies or theology in the university.
Yeah.
You've given some nice examples of how it's useful to understand the construction and the functions of the university, but within.
Right. No. This. I mean, this question. You probably know this is an impossible question. So I think I have a sense of what the vectors are of so when I break down the word theology, I think it gives me kind of two ways to approach it, and I'm like extremely. I want to be extremely clear that I only favor one of the two for my own work, and it's not to dismiss the other one. It's actually to hold the other one kind of above. And so I want to make a distinction between the kind of the philosophers and the mystics, right? And I think that theology has this kind of movement towards a helpful kind of intellectual movement in one direction, and also a very helpful mystical movement in another direction. And sometimes these can become mutually exclusive, where the philosophers kind of wander to a point at which they're kind of left behind the core mystical call of theology, whereas the mystics can also sometimes reach a kind of anti-intellectual position, with respect to the tradition. And so these are two difficult horns to navigate. But if we take the word apart, theology, and just a kind of maybe a simplistic exercise of like theologos with like a big capital T, for God, and on the other hand, putting the emphasis on the logos and the big capital L, right? My sense is that there's kind of, especially across different traditions and understanding of theology, there's probably other ways, but these are kind of two different directions of modes of understanding. So in the first, with the capital T, the study of Revelation has to begin with, in some sense, the act of faith that there is revelation. Like it's not really theology until one, in some sense, kind of believes at some level, right, this thing. And so there is no such thing as a secular, you might say, theology on this account of theology, and the demands placed upon the theologian in that big capital T approach to theology, my sense is, are ultimately not primarily philosophical, or not primarily logocentric, or like they're not primarily intellect is to kind of carry us to ultimately the mind of God, or being, or essence, or that kind of a thing. And so I feel like when we read, for instance, like the mystics or mystical poetry, or like I taught a course this last summer on eros and education, which is what I'm talking about, and I found no better text to read than largely mystical texts, like Song of Songs, or the poetry of Rumi, or the autobiography of Santa Teresa of Avila, which are these kind of ecstatic, mystical, poetic, expressive texts that I absolutely see as not just theological, but I'm even willing to say this is a kind of theology. But I would say it's a kind of theology where the reverence for the revelation and mystery of God is primary to to whatever this thing called theology is. I don't see myself doing that work, really. It's not because I don't believe in God or because I don't have faith or those things, but it's not really, it's never really been my orientation to theology, although I recognize that lack of an orientation really as a almost like a personal defect, that you could say in some ways. But my sense is that like that kind of theology is ultimately about sanctification, holiness, those kind of pursuits. And I'm the son of an evangelist. I can recognize the merits and the virtues of doing that, but I haven't seen, I haven't really recognized my work that way. The second version with the capital L, I think, is a bit more Hellenistic historically, intellectually. I think it's a bit more about asking questions about the necessary and sufficient conditions under which this very unspeakable reality could be the case, right? And in that respect, it doesn't seem maybe that different from the first version, but I think it's very different, because those conditions are conditions that in some cases we want to say extend their way all the way into nature, and so we can find within nature these kind of traces of the divine that lead us to these larger abilities to understand the necessary and sufficient conditions of God. But there's something metaphysical about it, I think, in the second version, that makes it also deeply philosophical, and that's very much where I identify my work as really not really theology. I would call it more like philosophical theology, which is really putting a qualifier to distinguish between that capital T theology and that capital L theology.
Are the aims radically different between the two, ultimately?
Well, I mean, as a faithful Catholic, I don't think I'm allowed to say that they're not, but where they are radically different, especially with the question of the scholar, right, is I think the question of method is very different in both, right? And this is the thing I brought to talk about was, method, because there's an obsession with method, at least in the social sciences, methodology and method and stuff like that. And I was asked to co-teach a course on method, and I found myself reading Bernard Lonergan, Method and Theology, and it's an amazing, the opening chapter. I mean, whatever one thinks of Lonergan and of the Jesuits or whatever, I mean, the account he gives of method in the opening of that book, to me, is as capacious an account of any academic, scholastic, philosophical way of trying to seek after things or make sense of things or what have you. All that to say is that I don't know if the aims or the values are so much different, but I think the ways in which we pursue the questions are quite different, right? And I think that in some sense, if we think of text or as the artifacts in terms of books or essays or notions of rigor, I think that there is I think that those, if we can consider those as a method of sorts, right, or a medium of sorts, or a media, which they are, I think those look kind of different as well. And so, but the problem is that there are people who seem to bridge or do both. Like, I mean, reading the Confessions, it's kind of like, for me, it's a challenge of method. Like, am I going to read this as a psychology? Am I going to read this as a phenomenology? Am I going to read this as a devotional text? Am I going to read this as a exegesis of Scripture? Am I going to read this as a historical text? Am I going to read this as a theological in the first sense text or in the second sense? Or, I mean, am I going to say it's many things all at once and try to follow every single thing at every turn and every time? I mean, it's not clear to me, actually, that is it a pastoral text? Is this all a performance? Like, does he so aware that, like, the Vandals are caving down, that this is his last chance to leave behind? So, I mean, yeah, you think about Monica. I mean, that book for me is just so amazing because it explodes even this very simplistic division I've given. And the question of theology is kind of difficult. There's one account of theology with respect to this division that I do think has an outcome that answers your question in a sense that does say, yes, there are different values and aims. It makes me uncomfortable, but find it at least a compelling thought experiment. At least, most of the day I think it's true, but for now I'll underdetermine it. Jean-Luc Marion, he's a philosopher at University of Chicago. He gave a kind of a, I think after every philosopher turns like 65, they turn to like history and philosophy. Like that's like their thing. And Marion's doing that. And he gives this account of how the patristics, he claims, never called what they were doing theology. Theology wasn't really the lingua franca for what the early church fathers were doing or writing about. If you would have asked them what they were doing, even if you would have asked Paul what he was doing, they were doing something that was, relatively speaking, Greco-Roman, Greek, Latin, but it was basically philosophy, right? And philosophy could be understood in a few different ways. The way that Marion talks about it is, I think, in a more Hellenistic way. Thomas Merton has a lovely introduction to the City of God, to Augustine's City of God in the Modern Library, Old Edition, where he talks about philosophy in Augustine's time as also being, though, like a set of clubs. So, like, whenever you read Augustine's text, Against the Academicians, where he's fighting with different groups of skeptics, it's clear that for him, philosophy was like, what team are you on? Like, what philosophy? And there was even the philosopher's scarf, and they would wear, like, gang colors or whatever. And, like, it was this kind of, this idea that philosophy was about, like, the school of thought. And I think you can see that even in Plato sometimes, whenever you see, like, people identifying with different schools of thought. And, all that to say, though, that Marion says that during the time where theology, like Christology, when Origen is writing, whenever the first questions of the Trinity are being posed, whenever all of the kind of Christian dogmatic, systematic theology, moral theology is kind of bubbling to the surface, that at this time no one would have identified, historically speaking, that work as theological per se. They would have seen it as some variety of a philosophical endeavor. His claim is that after the kind of the transition into the Middle Ages, scholasticism really becomes theology, but it's theological in the sense that it's trying to make sense of, defend, and work on the claims made by the patristics. So when you read Augustine, yeah, he's in dialogue with the philosopher Aristotle, but he's primarily working on questions posed by Augustine. So Marion's provocative claim is that theology begins at the end of theology, right? In other words, theology kind of emerges in the scholastic medieval tradition, at least, after the kind of first philosophy of theology was carried out. You can see how this particular reading of theology heavily favors the second version I gave, as being more, in some sense, primordial to the first. I don't think it's satisfied, because then you have to say, well, Marion, you're forgetting about all the desert mystics that are running around at the same exact time in Egypt and around in the early Christian communities that are not forming themselves around the dogmatic, systematic, moral, theological traditions. They're doing something else, and I would say that has to be accounted for within one's account of theology. But clearly, the methods are different, right? And I think that those methods are, I think they're basically Hellenistic. This is so when I go into an overtly Catholic space, it's like the Catholic intellectual tradition. You can't understand it if you don't read the Iliad. Like you have to start with you have to understand that this is not self-possessed in a way. And I know it's very controversial within different conversations of Judaism about to what extent is Judaism Hellenistic or not. But I mean, I have a hard time thinking you can read Maimonides, for instance, without a pretty good sense of Plato and what have you. So, I mean, yeah, I'm using the word theology loosely across a few different ways. That might map some of them, the mystics on the one hand, the philosophers on the other. I see my work as philosophical, not particularly mystical, until maybe you start to add in my engagement with the arts and what art can do as opposed to philosophy. But that borderline to me is very mysterious and very difficult to work around. In education, the outcomes, I think, though, become very different. And at this point, this is why I don't think the outcomes can be ultimately different. Because I think there's a huge difference between pedagogy or what we see as like standard instruction in education, and then mystagogy. And I think that one of the basic misunderstandings of like cultural understandings of what education is amongst in pluralistic societies is that everyone who has a religious sense of education is never willing to settle for a pedagogical notion of education. There's always some idea of a mystagogical element in education that puts bigger things at stake than even just the formation of the individual or the civic group or society. And so, oddly enough, for me, I'm somewhat agnostic to the philosophy mystical question, but when it comes to education, right, there I think the stakes are quite high, and I think that, for instance, the question of the soul is just something we can't afford to abandon as like a human species with respect to what we think about when it comes to education. But then you could take the soul through the mystical route, or you could take the soul through the more philosophical route. And I find that, like, since psychology seems to be the lingua franca of education these days, that translates pretty quickly to philosophy. It's not as easy to get from there to the mystical, understandings of theology. But yeah, I don't know if that helps.
No, it's really enlightening and interesting. There are other questions? I want to keep asking questions.
Well, there are certainly other...
Do you need a glass of water or something, Sam?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. And my voice gets a little scratchy, but it's okay.
We can probably run some.
There are other theological traditions that emphasize a more historical approach. So you wouldn't even, where I come from, you wouldn't even, no one would ask you the question if you do this as a person of faith or as someone who inquires texts and materials. Because the historical tradition is so strong that you wouldn't, so whereas you seem to wrestle with the question, do I do this as a person, as a good Catholic, as a faithful Catholic, or do I do my work as someone who's entrenched in this Catholic Bildung, this Catholic tradition? So it doesn't. I don't see the conflict you kind of posed at the beginning. Or maybe I misunderstand, but you seem to be clear that you're working in a secular institution, and it's not a Catholic institution, and you have a very calling is one thing, but you have an appointment.
Sure.
And it seems to blend, but so it is a conflict if we make it a conflict, but maybe you have encountered certain issues where you feel like you can't do certain things because you're a faithful Catholic. I'd be curious if there is a conflict.
Sure.
But, and I want to, before I forget, so Augustine is not only in the Catholic tradition.
Yeah, I know that, yeah.
Yeah.
He is a bishop, though, at Hippo, so
after all, Martin Luther was...
Of course.
Was an Augustinian monk. And took issue with the hierarchy. And,
that's right.
That's why we had a major impulse towards enlightenment.
Sure.
But that's different.
No. Point very well taken.
Just want to make sure. It's not. We talk Christianity, and as Harnack once said, so Christianity is a thinking religion, and not. He didn't say the Catholic Church is a thinking institution.
Yes,
so
of course.
Just want to make sure that.
No. This is so. You're picking
bigger
up,
picture.
No. This is really useful. So you're picking up sort of two things. One, which I think I want to dispute, but the second, which I just kind of very. It's interesting how, like, in an interdenominational ecumenical discussion, it's just as important to me to kind of hyper-identify the fact that not just that I'm a Catholic, but I'm a Roman Catholic, Latin Rite Catholic, because obviously there's other Catholics as well, and we could have a Byzantine Catholic or a Melkite Catholic or a Coptic or the Orthodox who walk in the room at any time. It's not just the Catholics and the Protestants in the kind of generic sense, but. Yeah, I it's interesting. I'm growing to be able to have a more productive engagement with the larger Christianities on certain questions. But it does here my Roman Catholic sensibilities do kind of, there's a major obstacle to that. Whereas engagement with like Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, it doesn't seem for whatever. I mean, I don't even know what this is. If maybe it's dispositional, maybe it's more regional, maybe I'm just not a very good thinker. Like, I mean, but for whatever reason, I don't have as good a job. I don't do as good a job of kind of finely slicing that side of things. And if I may, I think some of that's because growing up in a largely in the Bible Belt of a Protestant American experiment, you kind of learn to kind of hunker down on your Catholicism. I mean, even in the Bible Belt, there are many Roman Catholics who you say, like, are you a Christian? They say, no, I'm a Catholic. Yeah, but we didn't make that up in that case. It was actually told to us by the Baptists and the Church of Christ, right? And so we kind of believed them and kind of built that. But no, that point's very well taken. The first point, though, about the conflict, I mean, I understand the sense in which well, for instance, there is an approach to religious studies that does kind of say that these confessional, devotional concerns, even my account of theology that I gave, is kind of like a little bit out to lunch. I mean, the real questions are, in some sense, historical, critical, sociological, evidence-based texts, hermeneutical, whatever. But they're not really, they're not confessional in nature. I just find it very difficult as someone who is as I mean, for me, I cut my teeth on, the call of Socrates to make music, Marcus Aurelius's meditations, the consolation of philosophy, and then by the time I got to Augustine, I was kind of already indoctrinated enough, but when I got to like book 3 and like my inner self was a house divided against itself, like that was just, I think I became a phenomenologist at that point, right? Because I don't so much see the questions of theology or religion or philosophy, but in an interesting way, most of all of education, as being containable within the more historical, analytical, hermeneutical approach, right? I mean. And that carries significant risks, and I hope I'm not naive about what those are. I mean, for instance, whenever I teach Hannah Arendt, I really like to teach, no surprises here, her dissertation on love and St. Augustine, right? But Arendt is not like your average Augustinian reading Augustine here. It's kind of, that's what makes it so interesting and fantastic and kind of infuriating in some cases. And so there I really need to be able to bracket like what I'm doing as a teacher and the text, and respect the text and read the text in a exegetical, not eisegetical way, what have you. But I also feel that at the very same time, I shouldn't completely turn the spigot of my love of not only Augustine, but also in a particular affinity for Arendt that doesn't, I think that there needs to be a little drop of that still kind of seeping into maybe not the content or maybe not the skills or method, but my kind of dispositional approach to the question, right? And this is where I guess this is for me the one of the bigger questions about the risks, I guess, of secularism or of a secular institution. In Tacitus and Agricola, he has this, I think it's a cliche now at this point, maybe you've all heard the story of the part where he talks about the Roman emperor who brings peace to an unruly province by killing all of its citizens. You ever heard that? And so Tacitus writes of this. He says, you create desolation and call it peace. And this is for me kind of the sensibility I have of a kind of the risks of an exclusive or an overdetermined sociological or historical or hermeneutical or methodological approach to whether it is theology or anything else. I do think that at the center of at least the educational value of this stuff or these institutions is really the person, right? And not just the Bildung, the developmental person or whatever, but like, I don't know, the whole person, or I guess I mean something like the soul in some way. And at that time, I think there's something more that's called for, but it's risky. So the last part of your question was like, have there been any moments where I felt I couldn't, do what I was asked to do and be Catholic? And I guess for me, it's that very risk, right? That my personalism that I think does come out of my faith and my intellectual training, and to some extent even I would even say it's somewhat cultural in other ways, but that at some point I would instead of leaving a drop, I would leave too much, and then I kind of break the. It goes from harmony to disorder in some sense, and I've seen that happen when, in a very clear way, or really flirt with that line in a very clear way, when students have a kind of affective response to a text or to a tradition or to a set of ideas, and come to me privately as a mentor, asking me overtly religious questions with respect to, in some cases, their own faith, or in other cases, decisions to make in their life, right? And this might be part of why I don't want to be a mystic, or a priest for that matter, but like, I get incredibly, like, I get all the allergies I think one would expect. Like, this is not part of my appointment, like, and there I want to kind of go in that other route, but, I had a student who studied the works of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian philosopher and educator, in dialogue, because he was in dialogue with the liberation theology of Latin America. So primarily Theology of Liberation by Gustavo Gutierrez, and some of the works of Leonardo Boff, and some of the papers from the Medellin conference, and then Puebla later. And this student, so this weird thing happened in my class. On the first day, because I kind of wanted to be like, I want it to be clear that we're reading Catholics in this room, and I just don't want you to I don't want to act coy about this, but I happen to be Catholic too. You don't have to be Catholic, that kind of awkward thing. And then all of a sudden there were like these confessional statements like, well, I'm Jewish, and and my dad is a Sephardic Jew, and then my mom is an Ashkenazi, and I'm like, okay, you didn't have to do that, and then that's fine. And then another guy's like, well, I was raised in a Mennonite community, so I don't consider myself a Protestant because we're just Church of Christ. I'm like, okay, fine. And so a German woman, Maren, so wonderful, like, I have no religion, but I'm a humanist. I love you all. Like, okay, great, fantastic. And then this one guy Zach, who's like, yeah, I'm kind of just an agnostic. I'm just interested in Freire, really, and his ideas on literacy. And I'm like, that's totally fine. Well, week 3, well, I'm kind of interested in not just Freire, actually. I mean, I was kind of raised Jewish, but who cares? And then the next week, and then by week 6, he and my other Jewish student are having arguments in Hebrew, right? Over, and turns out he went to yeshiva. I was like, and at the end of the term, he drops out of school, and he's now at rabbinical school in Philadelphia. And I had to talk to, and he was in a very exclusive residential school called Green College at UBC, and the director is a emeritus professor in my department. He's like, Sam, this is super weird. What's going on in your class? Like, this is kind of verging on inappropriate. Like, what in the world? And I was like, well, first of all, I'm not Jewish. I wouldn't know what to do to send someone to rabbinical school. And second of all, yeah, you're right. It's really weird. I agree with you. Like, what do you think of it? And he's like, it just seems kind of too much. My God, like, what is this about? Like, what are you guys doing? I was like, we're just reading books. I swear. That's all. We're not praying. We're not doing that, right? So that was a challenge. I mean, I don't know what that means or whatever. Zach has become a wonderful correspondent, and he's doing very well in his rabbinical training, and I think he found something that he couldn't have found otherwise. But my goodness gracious, I would never want that to be a outcome of my work. Like, in one sense, I don't want it to be, but it's clearly happening. Like, you know.
But that doesn't strike me as a problem of you being a Catholic. So that's, I mean, you're just being a good teacher.
You think so?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you offer space. A teacher, and in religious studies, I mean, we are all trained to look at this from a secular lens, and we study ritual, or we study a certain experience, and we study comparatively. But as Rudolf Otto in his book, The Idea of the Holy, which of course is a bad translation of the title,
Okay.
already in the beginning says that those who only had pubertary or emotions during puberty, or had issues with their digestive tract, or look at the world as social relations, but cannot name a particular religious experience.
Yeah.
So something that stands out of the psychological, the physiological, and the sociological. They shouldn't even start reading the book because they won't understand what religion means. So my point is, even in religious studies, we should be aware that for students who engage with these texts, there needs to be a space. And that might be texts we cannot, or whatever text we read, students or people, so the readers Otto had in mind, and I compare them to my students, they come with all sorts of questions. And
Sure.
but you're still a teacher at a secular institution. So you can provide space, but you still have to teach methods. You still have to teach comparatively.
Sure.
You still engage with the text as text and not as a religious document.
Yeah. But that's not so different than the way I read text as a religious, like, I mean, yeah, but go ahead.
I'm just curious about the Otto. Does Otto say if you don't have those experiences, you won't understand religion, or das Heilig?
Well, no, that's his point. Das Heilige, so the numinous is the experience, and that's, I mean, religion is a category sui generis, so it stands on its own.
Yeah.
And his point is you will not be able to understand how the numinous is experienced when you encounter it. And that, of course, is a claim long refuted by, and we can't do religious studies if we have Otto. I mean, catastrophe if we first have to be religious before we can study religion.
Yeah.
So I think what he means is that we cannot escape a certain reality once we engage with texts and liturgy or mystical experiences. So it's, but what it does for me when I teach is to allow my students to ask questions. Not that they matter when they write papers, but to be aware that those questions come up when students engage religious material, religious texts. So, and what you shared with us, you don't come across as a very Catholic guy. I mean, you come across as very Catholic when you go from Origen and Augustine through Thomas and Lonergan and Maritain and Rerum Novarum and stuff like that, or even liberation theology.
Sure, fair enough.
So because you're in a certain tradition.
That's right.
So you help students. Maybe that's the beauty of being at a secular university, that you allow students to think through the lens of a certain tradition, while they can also go through very different traditions.
Yes.
While they can, I mean, you have a student you said who reads the Gita. And I mean, maybe there is Raimundo Panica, but there aren't that many who make this accessible from the tradition you're yourself in.
Sure.
Yeah, so we, so there is a mixing,
Mhm.
a pluralism of methods
Yeah.
and perspectives, and I think that's so. As long as you have this disclaimer, that's the tradition where I'm coming
Mhm.
from. You don't strike me as, you're not out to convert students to become good Catholics. That's
Sure.
not, no,
Yeah.
you're a professor at a secular institution.
Yes. Yeah. No. I
And
think-
you help students to read,
Yeah.
to have these deep engagements with texts. And,
Yes.
and I think that is great. And
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you say this. I think I was at one point pretty much an Catholic evangelical, but I had two particular experiences that really don't pertain so much to this whole thing, and this might be a way to kind of maybe bring things to a close as the clock kind of strikes. But the first was I volunteered at Lourdes in the Lourdes the grotto in France. Largely, if you volunteer.
Some people might not know what
Oh.
this is.
strange place, isn't that?
Yeah. Well, I think it wasn't. I mean, it was. Yeah, sure. And so Lourdes is this place in France that has a large Catholic basilica built to commemorate, memorialize, and continue to practice rituals around an apparition of Mary to a particular saint in the Roman Catholic Church, Saint Bernadette. And it's a major site for pilgrimage for Catholics around the world. And it just so happened that I was studying in Austria at the time at the International Theological Institute, and if I had some time, and if I went and volunteered at Lourdes, I got free room and board. So I was not as pious as I should have been, but I was there, and I did my work, and a lot of my work was working in the baths, which were not these mystical spring waters or whatever. There's kind of actually looked like a public swimming pool kind of a thing, and people would come into these kind of cement blocks and lay down, and when you go out, you'd help them to cover themselves. And there was something though about these baths and bathing that was both kind of like a public swimming pool, but also like this was a religious devotional experience. So you wanted to maintain a kind of a prayerful attitude, I guess, or a reverent attitude, whatever. And coming out of my very kind of parochial Catholic view, I was just blown away at the quantity of non-Catholics who were in line for these baths, and most of them were Hindus and some Muslims. And I was just, I don't want to miscommunicate. I had no problems with them being there, taking the baths, and even in my own head, I went canonically, and I was like, yeah, there's nothing that disallows people from, and like at first, of course, weirdly, you're like, is this illegal? No, it's not. Okay, then it's fine, But then further on, I became quite like truly curious in a way, like what, like you're more than welcome here, but why? I mean, what is, like you said, it's kind of a weird place. Like, why would you be here? And so I got a chance to ask someone who spoke English, a Hindu woman, like, kind of, no offense, but I'm very stupid. Please tell me what's going on here, And she just said, look, this is a holy place. And a bath, and a holy bath, and a holy place is something that I as a Hindu respect, and I'm here to participate in that, and I'm so grateful, right? And it just blew my world apart. Like not in a destructive way, but it really showed me this kind of, the universality of the Catholicos, of the sense of Catholic I had at the time, was clearly insufficient to hold that experience in it. And so I had to make room for that experience and stuff. And I think about that often when I'm teaching in a secular institution, even though Lourdes is hardly secular in any sense. A few years later, I went through my kind of routine 22-year-old crisis of faith and reading about religions I'd never heard of, and from encyclopedias thing. And I remember being at a philosophy of education conference, a small regional conference, where I met another Hindu woman who had worked in Calcutta and Mother Teresa's school. And the way she talked about the school was so interesting, because I knew the whole, we hate Mother Teresa version of the story. And I knew, of course, the Mother Teresa is the greatest human being ever story. But she didn't talk either way. She was just very kind of sober-minded and very kind of wide awake about the whole thing. And well, the school did this, but it didn't did this. And I, as a Hindu, I felt very respected in this way, but I felt kind of not respected in this way. And I don't know, something about her being, and maybe that I had a couple whiskeys or something, but I just started to be like, wow, this is unbelievable. This is what I've been looking for. This is what and so I of course, as a fairly evangelical, still Catholic, I was like, well, when you find someone who has the truth, you have to convert, right? That's like the thing. And so I said, tell me, like, how does one become like a Hindu? Is there RCIA? Are there classes? Like, where's the, is there, like, do I have to register somewhere? Like, I'm not going to do it yet, but I need to inquire. And she asked me a very simple question. She says, what is your tradition? I said, oh, Roman Catholic. And she said, good. Well, here's how you become a Hindu. If you want to be a Hindu, you need to become a better Roman Catholic. And so, for me, there's a real kind of aphoristic wit at the heart of this, of like, am I Hindu or am I Catholic, right? And to me, the ability to kind of stand in that paradox a bit, but a paradox that I recognize in a devotional context, and Lourdes. To me, this is the word that I come to every time, through theology or through religion or through teaching or through philosophy. It's really wit, like the wit of religion, or the wit of the theological imagination, or the wit of the book that is not simply this or simply that, or the wit of being a Catholic reconverted to your own tradition through Hinduism. I mean, like the wit of life in a way, right? And so, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful at all, but that might maybe make a bit more kind of ordinary sense out of these kind of very kind of big, extraordinary kind of intellectual conversations. But I've taken you over time, and as a good teacher, I'm not supposed to do that. So, anyhow, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.